Evening. Thanks for joining us. This is our 5th installment on the question series. Myself and Duff here have been going through some different topics, as well as Alan at the beginning there. This week, we're kind of going to go through Rediscovering Jesus, we called it. Kind of just learning who is the Jesus that we believe in. I think all of us who grew up in the church, we have, maybe some of us have a moment when we kind of grew past the Sunday school Jesus that we learned about. We kind of grew up in our understanding of who he was. Or maybe some of us, we have never really kind of thought of that topic. And I think that's what we're going to do this week, is help us introduce some questions, help us introduce some is the Jesus that I grew up believing in, have I learned more about him? Have I grown up in my faith about who Jesus is? And there's been lots of challenges on who Jesus is throughout history that have been hostile as well as welcoming. There's been many challenges of, did Jesus actually exist? Who was he? I think as Alan said in one of his sermons a while back, like the definition of who Jesus is a very important topic. So I think this week is kind of going to be an introduction into that and helping ourselves and yourselves kind of rethink who you think Jesus is. And with that, please feel free to send in some questions. As we go along, I'll be checking into that and asking that of Duff as he goes through. So anything that he says, if there's something you would like clarified, please send it in. And as always, please send in your questions for us to address topics later on. We would love to keep doing this. To do that, we need some renewed interest in the sessions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Duff.
I'll start with a story from my own life. I was a Sunday school kid in a Presbyterian church. I could define grace before I could actually experience it. Yeah. Jesus becomes a figure of story and a very distant figure in a way for me in those years. He was a bit of a nanny in the sense that he was always nice, patting kids on the head, and not quite Mary Poppins, but there was a miraculous side to Mary Poppins too, And then there's Jesus, kind of the Jesus of story, a flannel graph, which people probably don't even remember. But from my generation, that was a storytelling device.
I'm old enough to remember it, which is unfortunate, I suppose.
Piece of paper you stuck on a piece of flannel and told the story that way. And Jesus was like Mr. Rogers, and this sort of thing. And then in the middle years of 13, 14, 15, began to experience lots of criticisms of Jesus from my teachers, from friends in school, a Jesus that I didn't recognize. And so for me, there was a need to kind of grow up my image of Jesus and my experience of him. He becomes more than just a figure of history, as the old Ralph Carmichael song goes. But there's a sense that Jesus in the late 60s, early 70s, when I was in high school, was the rebel. That was the Jesus everybody wanted. Che Guevara with the beret with the communist star on it and the beard. Well, it wasn't difficult to transfer that to Jesus carrying a carbine over his shoulder and going up into the Sierras with the revolutionaries, right?
Well, we tend to make Jesus our cultural hero.
Well, that's right. And then, of course, after that, Superstar, the musical, Godspell. Jesus is a little whimsical, but at the same time, infinitely more tender. But we also begin to get the tormented Jesus. You get The Last Temptation of Christ, a very profound but very controversial film, where Jesus is experiencing the human side to the point where people felt his divinity was being insulted. In fact, with any Jesus, somebody's going to be insulted. And that's one of the things that got me looking more closely at what I believed. Finally, in the 70s, I met somebody named Malcolm Muggeridge, a British reporter, famous commentator, a critic of our times, but also an apologist for Jesus and for Mother Teresa, who he spent a great deal of time admiring and made films about her. And one of his books was called simply Jesus Rediscovered. And I have to say, that's sort of what my experience has been since then, is putting away the stereotypes, the cardboard, the pop-up Jesus bobblehead on my dashboard of my Christian life, and putting that away, and then looking around, realizing that who is Jesus is, there's so many different answers, but so many of them don't quite work, you know? I mean, Jesus the revolutionary, the Jesus the freedom fighter, Jesus the clean cut, never put his foot wrong, never never hurt anybody's feelings, Jesus. Right? All those things, no, it doesn't work. So I had to go back to the Bible and re-examine it. And then you discover, of course, that first of all, Jesus is rejected. Constantly rejected. To the point where even in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's rejected by his Father in heaven. And on the cross, of course, is the ultimate rejection.
Yes.
And so suddenly we realize, wait a minute, my hero, my Jesus, my Savior, my Lord, is the rejected one.
Yeah.
And that was a shock at first, and one that I've begun to realize is the normal way it should be. It explains also the rough ride that we get as Christians in our society.
Right.
Because the Jesus we follow is not the one people want. Most people create a Jesus in their own image, an idol. Right.
And that's why we're kind of addressing this as well, is because if we don't have an appropriate investigation into who Jesus is, our behavior itself, our faith itself, kind of reflects the world more than him.
Yeah, I mean, you could have a Jesus. In fact, we used to joke when I was a younger person about who would be the chaplain on the Starship Enterprise.
Yes.
And everyone said, well, it would have to be Spock. And you'd say, why Spock? Well, because he's like Jesus. What?
Yeah.
You know? And yet you could see in a way there was something mysterious, something magisterial, the Jesus that never gets ruffled, this kind of thing. You could see that kind of thinking. But it's not accurate either, because Jesus is on the extreme edge of human emotions at times.
Yeah.
In fact, there are people who, the movies about Jesus, if we kind of line them all up, starting in late 60s with the St. Matthew's Passion, right?
Yeah.
Which is a very strange kind of film. Looks more like something made in Mussolini's time. At least Herod's soldiers looked like stormtroopers,
Yeah.
But you also have the greatest story ever told. And there's Jesus is very Scandinavian, and he's so impersonal, he's so level, he's so emotionally flat. You think he's on Prozac.
Right.
Wandering through the scenes, using the words, but where's the compassion? Where's the edge? Where's the anger that leads to the passions,
right,
of Jesus? And so I really began to look at this and think, we've got to go back and look what the Bible says and read it more carefully. Everything we've done in this series has been, we thought we knew what the Bible said, and then we looked more closely and we realized we have to kind of scrub our minds of stereotypes and illusions. Right. So that's where I want to go tonight.
Excellent. So I imagine there's a few stereotypes that you have in mind, and then some scripture to kind of flesh out to go with that.
Look at how frustrated he can get.
Yeah.
You look at the Gospels, and there are moments where he says things that are not very Christian. Like he says to disciples, how can you be so dumb?
Yeah.
How long do I have to put up with you?
Yes.
He sounds like a teacher that I remember, handing back tests and exams.
Yeah.
Were you guys not listening? And the answer, of course, is they weren't. Sometimes they were sleeping.
Yeah.
Sometimes they were babbling, and they were always arguing about who was going to be the most important, because their hearts are set on this war they want to have.
Yeah.
They want Jesus with the lightsaber, and you can't blame them. I mean, the Old Testament picture of Messiah that everyone missed was the one from Isaiah about Jesus, the Messiah, suffering. It's interesting that it's actually Jesus' job to reconnect his people with that passage in Isaiah about the suffering servant. He really has to keep dragging them back to it and then embody it. Mm-hmm. It's interesting in the Middle Ages, for example, the great Bible translator, Jerome, made some mistakes. And one of them was he took the Isaiah passage and wrote about the suffering servant in such a way that it gave the impression that the suffering servant would have leprosy.
Right.
And so the teaching in the Middle Ages kind of grew up around 1200, 1300, that Jesus did have leprosy, and that leprosy was not this evil curse, it was a messianic mark.
Right.
And so the crusading soldiers, by the way, leprosy had was not really that well known in Europe until the Crusades. And then the Crusaders brought back a very hideous Middle Eastern form of leprosy that was so disfiguring that often these guys would have to be isolated from society.
Right.
And so in the 12 and 1300s, Christian idealists who were trying to minister to Jesus in physical form created something called the lazaret, the hospital for remember Lazarus was the leper, and so suddenly these knights come back and they're afraid to come home because they look so awful, and they're embraced and given basically hostels to live in where idealistic monks and nuns are ministering to them, because this is the Jesus that they're expecting, the one who suffers.
Right.
Mistranslation leading to an invention of something, the hospital, that we still have with us today. But it's this portrait of Jesus, but it's also a portrait of God. You know, we have an interesting dilemma here. Hebrews, book of Hebrews talks about the way in which Jesus is such an icon, that's another passage, but such an identity with God the Father, that he shares the same mind with God. And he says in John, I and the Father are one. Powerful statement. But it means that when we see Jesus, we actually are seeing God. And when we see the mind of Jesus, the emotional makeup of Jesus, we're actually getting an insight into the emotional nature of God the Father.
I think for myself, that was one of the biggest hurdles for me in that Jesus is God. Well, that's a statement I heard when I was 4. But to understand that God is Jesus, well, you know where I'm going with that. Like that God is the Trinity, but God, like Jesus is who God is, and that the emotions that he shows and the way he interacts with people is how God interacts with people.
Well, look at how often Jesus breaks down in tears.
Yeah.
You know, he is in tears at Lazarus's tomb.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting questions there is, of course, why is he crying? Why is he late? He's several days late. Lazarus has been in the grave for a while. But what are the tears about? And there are all kinds of attempts to guess about that. But the bottom line is, if Jesus is crying at Lazarus' tomb, God weeps too.
Yeah.
And if Jesus is crying over Jerusalem, I wanted to save you, but you wouldn't let me, the rejected Jesus in tears. You understand, here is the outrageous grief of God the Father being rejected by his own people, you know. If anyone should have understood and recognized Jesus, it should have been his people, but they don't. Yeah. And so this pain, and then of course the tears in the Garden of Gethsemane, where, you know, God is silent. But at the same time, there is an emotional unity between God and Jesus that means that God is feeling this pain at a profound level. And so you learn about God and his emotional life. God has an emotional life. That was itself denied for many centuries by some Christian theologians. But it's evident from the incarnation, what Jesus on earth, that God does have an emotional life because Jesus shows it to us. As well as anger. Stark compassion that stabs you in the gut, as the text says. You know, he could be frustrated. He was really vividly angry with hypocrites. You could see him beyond just miffed or being in a snit. There's a sense of real indignation there. So that the emotional life of Jesus is
hypocrites not being like sinners, but hypocrites being religiously oppressive sinners, so to speak.
People who choose the wrong path with their religion and make it toxic. You know, that's for something for him. He's thrilled by simple faith. You can almost see him with joy and excitement when the 12 come back and say, look what happened when we were out there, Jesus. And Jesus says, you know, this is what God does. He comes to the little children, and Jesus is delighted, you know. It's not impossible to do, as, remember in the 70s there was a sketch of the laughing Jesus that became very popular for a while. And I remember people looking at it saying, I never thought Jesus could laugh. And yet, you know, we know that there's no verse, and we know he wept. But is there a verse where Jesus laughs? Well, no, but why not? You know? There's a famous passage by Philip Yancey, who wrote a very interesting book I'd recommend to everybody called The Jesus I Never Knew, which says, when you go to write the life of Jesus, you actually end up learning an awful lot about yourself. As well as learning about God. And I think that's a question that I would like people who are watching tonight to really think about noting, if they were to look at Jesus and say, what are the things in Jesus that I want, I need, I like, and then do a little inventory and say, how many of these things are your personal faves?
Right.
Your choices, your definitions of who Jesus should be, and then go find them in the Bible.
Yeah.
And if you can't find them in the Gospels, you may have to revise your Jesus.
And that's a big part, is that as you said earlier, the disciples, Jesus constantly asked them, like, do you not see? And the implication is yet, like, why don't you see after all this teaching? And they were, we know, I mean, from our Jewish studies and archaeology and stuff, is that they were very culturally blind. Is that they expected a certain thing. And I suppose that's our aim today, is that how are we reading our own definitions of who he is?
Yeah.
And hence your reference to the movies, because movies are a cultural meme, a cultural medium.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's one of the most interesting things now, is we actually have a very critically, popularly well-received series about Jesus right now on Netflix, or one of the series. And so we have a Jesus that reflects our time every time. Yeah. It's no coincidence that in Superstar, the movie, the Herod soldiers look like Israelis with Uzi machine guns and chrome helmets, right? And Judas is staggering through tanks racing by. In the same way that you look at the Jesus movie that was made and used with great effect around the world, you have a Jesus who is divorced from that, but is very much the people's Jesus of love, compassion, simplicity. And that's why it made such an easy translation of Jesus to other cultures.
Yes.
It was a beautifully crafted piece, and yet it was restrained. There was a lot of restraint there, possibly because it wasn't made for a Jewish audience. So we look at that and we realize that as we portray Jesus, that's why, for instance, the Zeffirelli film that came out in the mid-'70s, that was very popular, was very much a Catholic icon, Jesus. Beautifully shot, with all the skills of a director who had had a close call with death and wanted to make an icon. And Anne Bancroft makes an amazing character. But it's also at the same time a perfect picture of how the 70s would look at Jesus. There's been several attempts since then. One of the most off-center but interesting is Johnny Cash's The Gospel Road.
Yeah, I've seen parts of that. Yeah, the blonde smiling.
Well, yeah,
strolling through the fields, almost like a music video. Jesus.
Yeah, it is. And then with the pigeon dove on his shoulder, and they're communicating. There's a moment of intimacy there that is well worth capturing, in the sense that you have a sense of Jesus being in sync with nature. There's also a wonderful scene later where his crucifixion occurs at a corner gas station. Where the traffic is racing by on all sides, a world rushing on by itself and not paying attention. And it's also, those are profound theological insights, but they're not a good guideline to the real Jesus.
And that's what you're going to be diving into, is the textual Jesus.
We have to go back to that and understand that even as we understand the time, the setting, we also, it's not wrong to think of first century Palestine or Judea as being like Afghanistan. In fact, the population is about the same. The terrorism is about the same. The anger and the rage and the controversies, the alienation of foreign military there who are becoming increasingly frustrated and increasingly angry and acting out. And Mike Warnke did an interesting soliloquy about some time he spent in Vietnam and how he could understand American soldiers turning on the Vietnamese people because they didn't understand why they were there, why they could never go home. You see some of that occurring in Afghanistan. And so to imagine Jesus in a context today, that might be the closest to the setting we're talking about.
Duff, I haven't heard it put that way, and that seems pretty apt. I mean, definitely, at least on the surface, that does seem pretty apt as far as the culture of the Jews inside of a Greek culture, inside of a Roman domination. And the kind of culture that Jesus led.
And the temptation of all the outside world to write the place off. The way people think about the average Afghan person is a combination of confusion, pity, and rejection, really.
Right.
That's why our armies have almost all come home.
Yeah.
Our policies have all been given up on.
Yeah.
One of my friends who teaches at RMC says basically the West has convinced itself they lost, whether they actually did or not.
Yeah.
You know, and so we try to forget about it as much as we can. Well, that's how the Roman Empire looked at Judea. You know, it was a place that really was hardly worth keeping, except it happened to be on a strategic location. The highways crossed there, the shipping lanes crossed there, and we had to have some place to put some legions in case Persia attacked, you know, kind of thing. But really, if we had a choice, we'd rather just blow the place up and move to Florida, you know, kind of thinking. And the attitude of the Roman soldiers, with the exception of some centurions who come across as generally fair-minded, if a little out of their depth at times, is so different from the soldiers.
Right.
It's a terrible place to be anyone, much less to be the Son of God. And why?
Right.
To introduce him there, you know, is another one of those riddles. Because when he comes, he's sort of, in the terms of his own people, who are wanting a Taliban leader, he's a failure. He's kind, he's soft, he turns away from force. He's actually remarkably good with children.
Yeah.
You know, very few heroes, other than the odd pat on the head or the seeking out of a moment of, you know, inspiration with a child. There's a wonderful scene in Lord of the Rings, right, where Aragorn sits with the child in Helm's Deep, and they're comparing their swords. And Gandalf has a good moment later on. And you have those moments of connection. But really, Jesus actually blesses them and protects them and teaches with them, and with women as well. Yeah. There is something about Jesus' relationship with women which is almost unacceptable to his own people. You know, think of the synagogue where the men pray, "I thank you, Lord, that I am not a woman." You know, and here's Jesus turning to them and treating them as equals, with respect, with compassion, with a fairness. At the same time,
direct relationship.
Well, no kidding.
Engaging verbally.
Absolutely. This is someone who, in fact, as a man, he is remarkably like a woman, which is why one sister, Sandra Schneiders, who wrote profoundly about this in the 80s, said, you know, it's interesting that Jesus comes as a man with so many feminine characteristics. It's probably the only way he could be recognized as divine. Because if he'd come as a woman, nobody would have noticed. What a wonderful woman, good with kids, kind, compassionate, helps the sick. You know, this is somebody who would make somebody should marry that woman, you know. But when a man from Galilee behaves this way, he really does stand out. And it's a statement about God's attitude to women, which is countercultural at the time. And frankly, in our own culture, as we've said before in this series, it's countercultural in our own time to treat women that well, you know. So Jesus brings a capacity to the rounded full humanness that we see in the Gospels that you wouldn't get in your average compressed half-hour Sunday school lesson. You have to sit down and read it as an adult to find the adult Jesus. And when you do, you discover that you have to give up some old, long-cherished ideas.
So what are some of the ideas that you've given up, Duff, and embraced as you've studied?
Well, I think one of them is the impractical Jesus. You look at Jesus and you say, okay, this is all very good, but we can't really do this, you know. And what we find, of course, is that he's got a common sense. You know, he's a carpenter's son. He has skills. And that, to me, was significant, to recognize that there's a sense in which, you know, Jesus could heal Peter's mother-in-law and get that door that never swung straight working, and probably get that shelf that Peter could never get straight hung properly on the wall. Had an eye for that stuff. He knows how to navigate a boat. He knows the people. He knows the place. But he also knows the heart. And he's very commonsensical about emotions and about what's right and what's wrong. In fact, if anything, there's a kind of roll up your sleeves, let's use the law the way it's meant. You can almost see him smiling as he's got the paralyzed man being lowered down through the hole in the roof.
Right.
It's a moment of comedy in a way. This should not be in a proper messianic narrative. There's a bit of humor here. And you can see Jesus there's bits of clay and some hay coming down, and there's rustling up top, and then suddenly a shaft of light cracks through. Next thing you know, there's 4 heads looking down, and then this guy is lowered down.
Yeah.
You know, I always think of that when I think about how many of our churches have wheelchair ramps. We had a guy in Kingston in my church, and we had a long set of steps, 12 feet, almost straight up. He was a navigator in World War II, and he came back and he got polio. He spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. We would haul that guy up those steps every Sunday.
Yeah.
No ramp, no elevator, but always enough ushers around who were young enough and sturdy enough. He just hung on to those brakes for dear life, and we carried him back and forth. You know, that's the kind of thing that Jesus understands. That Jesus would bless. And you know, every church that makes extra accommodation to make sure those people can get in and out, they're in his footsteps.
Yeah.
He sees that, and I think he smiles.
Yeah.
You know, he sees that sense of the practical. There are people, you know, they're not theological, but boy, they can shovel snow and they can fix a drain. You know, and those are the kind of people that, because he made matter, and he made the kind of things that needed to be engineered like that, there's a sense that his faith has that practical side to it as well.
Yeah.
Let's not get too mystical here when I'm talking. I'm going to tell stories about people you understand. The parables are about farmers, laborers, housewives, and that again is the way in which Jesus operates, although at a certain point you can see an edge.
Yeah.
The miracles, for example. You know, we talked a bit about miracles ahead of time. Jesus only does about 36 miracles in all 4 of the Gospels. Over 3 years, that's only a dozen a year, 1 a month.
The ones that are worthy of note.
Sure. I mean, there's other passages where it says he healed the sick at night and so on. But in terms of ones that are actually focused on by the Gospel writers. And so I have the impression that the miracles are sure, they're signs of his ability to command nature. They're signs of his divinity. They're signs of the essence of God. But there's a sense in which Jesus does not want the miracles to get in the way of his teaching and his modeling of the kingdom. Because when he does a miracle, he tries to close it down. Don't tell anybody. Or keep it quiet. You know.
So how does this challenge our impression of Jesus then, in understanding the miracles in context?
That I think he actually wants to take our mind off them.
Right.
You know, there's no doubt that if I have a sick relative, and I've had a few, and you want something, you sort of, oh, Jesus, if I have enough faith, if I pray, bring the right people, you know, dads especially want to fix things for their kids, you know. And yet the bottom line here is that most of the time, life went on in Judea and in our time without miracles. And if there are miracles, sometimes they appear to be this natural forces speeding up. C.S. Lewis once wrote that some of the miracles of healing probably are really natural forces in the body that could heal, but they've been given a boost, you know, within the framework of creation. But the bottom line is, it's not about the miracles. It's not about the bread for the masses. In fact, they can be a problem. Remember how the crowds would follow Jesus around, and at one point, having fed them all, they come mobbing after him to make him king, you know? And he has to look around and say, let's get out of here, you know? Because he can't get his work done. He even gets impatient at times with the insistence on miracles because they get in the way of his other work. And he has to disappear for a while. There's a period where he goes to Caesarea Philippi, he goes up to in the north into Syro-Phoenician territory, and then does a long loop around to the other side of Lake Galilee. And you know, the question is, oh sure, he's taking time to spend focusing on teaching the disciples, but I think it's also to sort of let the overheated expectations of the messianic miracle worker cool down.
And that ultimately ends up not only cooling down, but almost becoming hostile. That all those efforts to make him king in the way that they understood ultimately fail, and so when it fails, they're hostile to
the rejection comes
because he
in.
can't be the Messiah if he's not can't be the Messiah if he's not king.
Yeah.
And maybe that's in a way is how we define kingdom, and how we define the Messiah could also get in the way and make us almost hostile towards the Jesus when we're confronted by how the Bible talks about him.
Yeah. Why won't you do what we want you to do? Don't you care?
Yeah.
You know, and then Jesus again has to sort of say, well, my kingdom is not like that.
Yeah.
Here's another one. For the first 1,000 years of the church, people said the church, they meant Jesus. And when people said Jesus, they meant the church.
Yeah.
But the second 1,000 years, the more we've gone on, the more we've dissociated Jesus from the church. It's really interesting right now. I was listening to a documentary on Friday or Saturday last week. And the one native Christian said, the problem is not Jesus. It's the container that the Europeans brought him in.
Right.
Schools, residential schools, and so
Yeah.
on. And later on, another native man said, look, I have no respect for Christianity. I have no respect for the church. I have no respect for priests. I have no respect for ministers.
Right.
But Jesus, now that was a Dakota man,
Right.
And you realize that in the last maybe 50 to 100 years, it's almost impossible for people to put Jesus in the church.
Yeah.
There's been a dissociation to the point of almost an enmity being posited between Jesus and the church. And I think we today are dealing with that. I think the churches suffer from that.
Yeah.
And I think we should, because probably in the way we conduct ourselves, we've actually created an institution where Jesus would be crucified all over again.
Yeah.
And I think that's the great irony that right from Kierkegaard on in the 19th century, that tension grows and grows. Dostoevsky, another great writer, probably one of the most profound writers about the human condition and Jesus, says that, if he ever appeared, the Inquisition would pick him up and burn him in a minute at the stake.
Right.
Because he's too threatening.
Yeah. And yet in that threat into our culture, somehow we reconcile that threat to, the threat of the image of Jesus that we may not want to embrace, but also with the promises that he still died for those who crucify him, that he still calls in some crazy way, knowing who we are and how we've acted and everything, in some crazy way, this same Jesus who is God calls us his bride.
Well, look at what he says on the cross.
Yeah.
He says, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Which means that if God takes his son's forgiveness authorization seriously, the people who crucified Jesus are forgiven.
Yeah. And maybe is that why it's important for the church to have a very good understanding of who the historical Jesus is, so that we reflect who he is to the culture around us, and say the church is, it may be more like the first 1,000 years. The church is Christ's body. The church is Christ's bride. You can't dissociate the two.
That's right. And that means there's responsibility, accountability, but also inspiration.
Yeah.
Because, for me...
There's a joy in that, knowing that you're loved and welcomed. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's liberating, to use a modern term, to realize that there are times when to be a Jesus person in a church is to be unconventional.
Right.
And maybe even anti-institutional, One of the things I like about this church is it doesn't run itself as an institution. For all the issues we might have, it's not a corporation. Right. And when you get a congregation that is a corporation, you have problems, I think. There's danger there. Yeah. There's power and efficiency. Yeah. It gets things done. But, getting things done can take your soul.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we see in the first century, in the environment Jesus is in the kind of people that are crying out for Jesus because they're crying out for God, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the people who realize that their yearning for God it's not working in the avenues for God that have been created for them.
Yeah.
It's got to be the person of God walking to them and walking with them.
Yeah.
Going to their house, eating with them. Jesus goes to a lot of parties for someone who's supposed to be a saint.
Yeah.
And this suggests that as a friend of sinners, Jesus will be found and his people will be found sometimes in places where they're not normally expected or accepted to be, and yet blameless.
That's still one that we have trouble with as a modern church. Like even those, we tend to think of our binary thinking in that there's some who, because of their personality and their upbringing, almost push the boundary on that, and they revel in that. Well, Jesus was a partying Jesus, I'm going to go party. And then there's others who go, who discard that, and they do the other side of the binary equation, and they say, well, no, Jesus called us to be holy, and Jesus was holy, and so we take so much joy, almost like glee, I guess, not joy, glee in fighting over the partying or holy Jesus, that we forget what it meant when he was there.
Yeah, and that's important, because I think as a teenager, I remember at times rather taking lightly the idea that you could go anywhere and be with anyone and do anything and be a Christian and not be tainted, And then actually, at one situation I was in, actually meeting someone who was embodying Jesus and realizing that I was rationalizing, and that was quite a moment of insight to yourself.
Instead of embracing, the Jesus existing among outsiders, the Jesus existing, we've embraced either in our care for nothing attitude, we embrace not living like Jesus amongst everyone, or out of fear, we wall ourselves off from everyone in order that we can live more like Jesus, which looks nothing like Jesus as well. So it's almost like we haven't. I feel like that's a big internal conflict still, like internal by like each individual, about how to go about that. Yeah.
It reminds me though of another dilemma that Jesus encounters, and that of course is he's Jewish. And his Jewishness is so thoroughly Jewish. It was in Jesus' time that the practice of wearing a phylactery, where you bind the bits of the law, leather straps in the little box on you, was coming into practice. So it's quite possible that Jesus wore a phylactery.
Haven't seen a movie with that yet.
And you realize that he's in a climate of expectation where he's rejected by his people because he's a disappointment. Jesus is this tremendous disappointment to his people, besides being a disappointment to his mother and a few other things, But there's a sense in which, in that environment, about 150,000 Jews died before Jesus was born fighting the Romans.
And hundreds of thousands after.
Well, no kidding. And so we have then this expectation which is so determined towards war and liberation that the disappointment in Jesus, look at after the Palm Sunday entry into Jerusalem, right? How can they turn on him in a week? Well, the answer is because the expectations are black and white, they're radical, and Jesus is this tremendous disappointment. And so the rage with which he's dealt with, the way in which he's traded up for Barabbas in no time, gives us an indication of the dangers of our own expectations of Jesus.
Where we trade him for someone, the Jews may have traded him for someone who was reflects more their insurrectionist. But we may trade him for someone who looks a bit more oppressive, or maybe it looks a bit more, I'm going to live where nobody else is so that I'm not tainted. Or
let's take a time let's take a time in the 80s. 1980s, something was invented called the moral majority. And it was tied, James Dobson and other people built up this idea that it was time to take America and make it a covenant nation. Well, by the way, America never has been a covenant nation.
No, God hasn't agreed to a covenant with any nation since Israel.
That's right.
But that's a basic understanding. Anyway, I could go into that.
I know.
I never understand that.
But the understanding now is that somehow America is, and that in fact,
Canada or England, whoever standing in those nations.
Well, Britain had its moments with that too. But what happens, of course, is it breaks down. World War I pretty much put an end to the British Empire, though it took another generation to run down. But here we have a problem now of what I think might be a similar phenomena. Because what's happening is, as our moral majority, which has now become, out of the culture war, the Christian right, becomes more disappointed or more defensive, if their expectations of victory if there are attempts to coerce and force a certain moral code that they think is Jesus' code, if they continue to get frustrated, will they become as violently angry and militant?
Yeah.
And the answer seems to be yes.
And on the other side too, I think violence is the almost the end result of the ultimate saying that Jesus, you got to look like what my cause is, and as soon as you don't look like my cause, then I'll discard you rather than my cause.
Well, that's what might be happening. Even though the talk is God talk, and the churches talk the God talk, the gospel of Jesus Christ is slipping away.
Yeah.
And in the end, will there be Christians in that group who are living in a tainted institution, but a toxic one? And the fear I have is that we will let that happen without pointing out to the world there's a choice.
And that's why it becomes so fundamental that we know who he is from the text, because otherwise we just create a God, we create a Jesus who allows us to wave our cause's flag at the expense of the kingdom that he's actually trying to do.
That's right.
And insert any adjective in front of that cause that you want. It doesn't matter what political stripe you are, that's the end result of it.
And attempts to compel morality always produce a backlash.
Yeah.
And that's what we're getting now.
Yeah, and morality, and whatever your definition of morality is.
Yeah.
You used covenant ideas in the United States as an example, but there's also very, I hate to use political words, but we're just going to say it. There's also left and right ideas that color Jesus with their political morality.
Oh, no kidding. Yeah. Yeah, and that's the danger. In the worst case scenario, it was the Nazi Aryan Jesus of the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah,
you know?
which the Germans did.
In 1933, a conference was held in Germany, a church conference, and it was a parting of the ways. There were pastors then who realized that the proclamation of the Nazi Lutheran Church had to be opposed by the confessing Lutheran Church, and they had to go underground. At the same time, Christians who were able to separate their politics from their personal belief in Jesus died like flies on the Eastern Front, the Western Front. You know, and these are the people that I know from my studies often were encountering chaplains and soldiers on the Allied side who could not quite figure out how you could put that together. But the personal piety can be separated from a politics that's totally inhuman. And people not notice. Nationalism takes the place of obedience. You know?
And I think maybe that's why it's just so fundamentally important for us to know who Jesus is. Because the best way in history, I think, for any one person or one cause to get Christians on their side is to say Jesus looks like this. And Christians to combat that need to know need to know what Jesus looks like.
That's right. I think my microphone has just collapsed here and I've lost my batteries. Excuse me.
Very good.
So Mike, looking at your experience, when you talk to people about Jesus, what kind of Jesus do you run into?
I think I like to start. It depends on who you're talking to, I think. And that's where the Holy Spirit comes in. But I like to start where God starts, in that he died for us. So that unrelenting pursuit of us to the point of death has become recently for me an inspiration for my own behavior. And so when I talk to people who Jesus is, I hope that my own behavior models that, in that it's the unrelenting, loving, compassionate pursuit of humankind in relationship to the point of death, to the point of suffering, to the point of irrationality. I think to the point of like, you're more important than me. And Philippians goes through that, and you're more important than I am, even to the point of my suffering. And I think, okay, you asked, so I'm going to answer. I want to have you be talking far more than I, but when I was taking an ethics course at university, we went through a bunch of different types of ethics in a very surface level. It was just a business ethics course. And I remember thinking as I was going through, we started going through care ethics. Feminism embraces a lot of care ethics. And I remember thinking, and I said this to a couple of my classes, I said, if I wasn't a Christian, I'd be a feminist. And they said, well, and they had the wrong impression of Christians. Christians,
right.
like more virtue-based and all that kind of stuff. I said, well, I said, from my understanding at the surface level here, care ethics is all about, others focused until it becomes toxic to your own survival. And I said, well, a Christian takes that a step farther. So I said, if I wasn't a Christian, I'd be a feminist. In that, as a Christian, I don't need to be a feminist as far as the ethical side goes, because I take it a step farther, is that you are concerned for others even past your own suffering.
Right.
And through your own suffering. And so when I talk to people about Jesus, I say that's who Jesus is at the beginning. And so both is an inspiration and a model for our own, how we express who he is as his hands and feet.
And I think it often starts with saying, what Jesus does in his time is he approaches people and they instinctively know that he would ask them, how is your way working for you?
Yeah.
And the answer is, it's not.
Yeah.
And the ones who say it's not are the ones he's ready for, and they're ready for him. It's interesting that Jesus sort of says, how's it working for you? Try my way, follow me. Yeah. And that invitation leads to something else. Absolute idealism, absolute legalism leads to perfectionism.
Yeah.
But Jesus' absolute forgiveness, absolute grace and compassion, so that in a way what happens is God is not us, God is for us.
Yeah.
And God is in front of us, and then God is in us.
Yeah.
Let me in.
Yeah.
And that's where we have, in a way, the discovery after the resurrection and the ascension, and at the day of Pentecost, the Christians discover that he is in us.
Yeah.
He's gone, and yet here he is. The ascension is interesting. Why did Jesus have to leave?
Yeah.
We look at that, and the answer is we don't know exactly. We have to guess.
Yeah.
But what it means is what follows is a realization that he's not gone.
Yeah.
He is in us.
Yeah.
And that is a profound breakthrough. But it also means, there's another question that goes with that I've often wondered about. Why did Jesus keep his scars?
Yeah.
The healed, perfect, risen Jesus doesn't have to have scars. Yeah. But he shows them. In fact, he presents them as a badge, which means, and I hate to say it, probably we have to have some too.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to our suffering conversation.
Yeah, to be authentic.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that someone who draws out our hidden sins but freely forgives the ones we acknowledge is the way, We have to admit vulnerability. We have to be humble. There's a lot of things about that as a person in this world, I don't think I want to be. I want to be strong and vulnerable, self-sufficient, self-actualized.
Yeah.
But the self-actualization that comes from self-denial, self-sacrifice, compassionate giving is, again, something that doesn't come unless you really are becoming somebody else.
Yeah.
Having that realization, that moment when you realize, I'm not the person I used to be. I was a person that if there was ever a fight, I had to win. People don't know that much about me, but at one time I was a very competitive athlete and a very competitive person in school, and I had to win. There was just no way around that. And yet people that look at me now would say that's really different, But that's partly because of a process of letting that part of me just give in to another part of me that wasn't there before.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of experience that makes me understand that whatever people say, Jesus did rise from the dead, Jesus is still active, because of the transformation I see.
Yeah.
People say, how do you know he's alive? And I say, well, first of all, I couldn't see the change in me. And I talked to some people once and they said, well, we have all these reasons for believing because of what different apologists have said. And I said, yes, but can you say that you're not the same person that you were before?
Yeah.
And they kind of, oh yeah, that's real.
Yeah.
And that's something to realize that what's happening is the transformation that occurs.
I think maybe we should kind of finish on that, and any more thoughts that you actually want to go through over the next maybe 5 or 6 minutes or so, and kind of flesh out how you've gotten to know, as you've explained, Jesus, and by knowing who Jesus is, both historically and relationally, how that's been transformative for you.
That's a very good question. I think there's actually a series of questions that we can ask ourselves, and almost kind of do a self-evaluation. And I think one of them is a very simple one, but one that does tell us a lot, is what pictures of Jesus do you have? You know, I grew up with a very famous Holman Hunt portrait, Jesus at the door with a lantern, behold a step. It was very famous, very popular at the time of my grandparents, and it was modernized. I even went and saw the original when I was in London.
Oh, wow.
Because it was so powerful during wartime. It's totally unrealistic. It is a Jesus that is angelic, that is like my grandmother, you know, supernatural grandmother kind of picture. The majestic, loving, caring, suffering. But all of it is out of the, not really biblical as I see it, right? It doesn't have the edge of history and reality. There's also, you know, the Jesus that is an iconic Jesus. And there's a reason for the icon. The icon is to make you pray, to lead you to pray. It's not to faithfully represent him. But the other portrait of Jesus makes him look very Scandinavian and very thin. It's quite possible that a carpenter's son could be quite burly, muscular. You know, the question of the beard, you know, and maybe side rings. But also the face that doesn't matter. You know, I think it's very significant that Jesus is never described. It's just not significant. What is significant, though, I think, is that we create pictures of Jesus that sometimes I think we should really just look around the house, as J.I. Packer said, think twice about any pictures we have of Jesus and turn them to face the wall.
Right.
To get at, to scrub our minds of the illusions we create. The idols we design.
A pictorial representation of who our cultural hero is, to go back to the beginning.
Because that might actually...
Just check the battery.
That might actually orient us. That might actually orient us to being... I think looking at that, scrubbing our head, the faces of the idols of Jesus out of our culture and out of our houses, out of our minds, would actually turn us in our praying to be more open to the voice. And less the picture.
And less of our own minds, but the actual voice of Jesus. That's great, Duff. Is there anything that you'd like to close on other than anything you'd like to bring up that we may have glossed over in the last hour that you'd like to finish on, or?
I think we still come back to the C.S. Lewis dilemma. You know, he often said, madman or criminal, or who he said he was. People have objected to that. The problem is, in 60 years, we haven't come across any better choice. And I think that's significant. Jesus, to have the love and sanity that he has, can't be a madman. And not be a monomaniac, and not be mentally ill. I think that's a situation here where we're looking at someone who is so authentically human that he has to be reflecting what God made us to be. For us to want in on and have him in us. It's just the only choice to be fully human.
And Paul says that too when he says Christ is the new Adam. There's so much in that sentence.
So much.
That's beyond salvation even. But Duff, I really appreciate some of the stuff that you said today. This is a topic that I've thought a lot about, and yet I haven't thought all of these things. So I appreciate it. As always, we're coming to the hour far too soon. So we'd like to close things off so you don't have to watch for 2 more, although we could definitely talk for 2 more. As anybody who knows both of us know, we could easily talk all night. I hope you, as well as I, have appreciated some of the questions that Duff has raised, and some of the maybe thoughts to leave with from this video, and to think, you know, I do have a Sunday school understanding of who Jesus is. Maybe I should look further into that. Maybe I should start reading the Gospels with more of an adult and as you said, experienced grace mindset. Those of us who are adults, we've experienced grace and suffering and forgiveness and oppression, and we've experienced all that. And if we read the Gospels with that, we start to see who Jesus is a little bit better. And of course, there are many, many, many resources that you can engage with as well. And Duff would have a lot of suggestions for which of those books you might want to peruse through. As we close off tonight, please send us in your questions. We would love to address some topics directly. We have a few more ideas, of course. We're thinking, we're trying to line up a talk about science and faith and the supposed combativeness of that. We're trying to line up a few more things as well, but we would love to address your topics specifically. So please send in your questions, and see you next week.
Great. Thanks, Mike.